Hey guys, another One Take Review, and today I want to talk about the new Charli XCX album, Crash. Crash is Charli XCX's latest album, and her first since 2020's How I'm Feeling Now, and she's had an incredibly interesting career up until this point. When she's not busy making very average pop and pop rock, she's making some of either the most fun or the most emotionally charged pop that's entered the mainstream in recent years. And I do think that Crash is sort of a nice meeting in the middle of those two very major extremes. The vocal work here is good because Charli is just generally a pretty great vocalist, and I don't think you need to go farther than a track like Good Ones or Lightning to see her ability as far as control, as well as a slightly above average range that really prove just how undeniably great of a vocalist she is and how much of a standout performer she is in the modern pop scene. With that being said, I do think that Crash kind of sees her lose some of her personality that was so apparent on the album I mentioned before, especially How I'm Feeling Now. And I think that she sort of sacrificed a bit of soul and spirit for a broader sense of commercialism, which is something I greatly respect and can appreciate from a personal standpoint and an artistic standpoint. But at the same time, I just kind of feel like it does prevent Crash from being particularly great, at least in terms of actual performance. Nonetheless, there isn't a single weak moment on Crash, at least not as far as vocals go, and this is just still Charli at her absolute best vocally. I think my big problem with Crash is that I think that this album thinks it's a lot more interesting than it actually is. There are a few minor details here, like the kind of aquatic backing synths in Beg For You, that really prove to be kind of interesting and make Crash barely stand out from other albums from Charli's peers and other similar synth pop and dance pop artists. And overall, I do think that there are a couple moments here overall that are at least slightly interesting in terms of composition, but I feel like the record is just a instrumentally, at least, and as far as progression and compositions go, a pretty normal pop album, and there's nothing wrong with that. Obviously, Charli XCX is not the person you should be going to for groundbreaking experimentation, even in her best moments. It's not like How I'm Feeling Now was some sort of groundbreaking moment in music where she just completely unlocked a new part of music theory that people were unaware of. It was just simply a very good album. However, like I said, there are a few small details here that do cause not only this album to stand out, but make me feel like there could have been something a little more adventurous being done on Crash. And again, there's nothing wrong with what is being done on Crash, but I just do feel like it could have been more than it ultimately is. Unfortunately, with all of those interesting pieces, there's just not enough pieces to make a full, intriguing puzzle, and what we're left with is Crash, a good album that has a high level of self esteem and a high level of self assumption of how creative it is, which both of which really have no grounds. As I said earlier, Crash is a solid meeting in between the two different sides of Charli XCX's music, and I do think that the obviously more dance pop kind of side shows through here, but I believe it's been sort of mastered and refined a little bit, and I think that as far as just sort of slickness and shininess, I guess, is the better term, I should say. As far as shininess goes, I do think that this is about as good as Charli's music has been thus far. This is largely thanks to a lot of behind the scenes people, sound engineers, producers, mixers that include Randy Merrill, A.G. Cook, George Daniel from the 1975, a variety of people that really help define this album's sound overall. Surprisingly, this album somehow isn't overproduced, even with the amount of people that worked on it. The people I mentioned were not even a quarter of the producers and mixers and sound engineers that all worked on Crash together, so I would really recommend looking up that list if you have the chance or want to. It's a very long list, but my point is, I'm surprised it's not overproduced, but then again, I suppose it's hard to overproduce an album that is quite literally defined by its sleekness. So I just feel like it's produced very well, and I think it should be more overproduced than it actually is logically. But I think that even though some people will find Crash's sort of glossiness a little too glossy for its own good, I personally enjoy it, and I think that the album's pleasant enough sonically to be an enjoyable listen even with its very crystal clear flaws. I will say that I do believe one of Crash's greatest achievements as an album is finding the perfect length. And I know that sounds stupid, and normally I wouldn't bring up something that minuscule, that unimportant, but just bear with me here. Crash manages to create the futuristic atmosphere that most modern synth pop does and often needs. It creates a very party-like tone that really defines the album overall and makes it a very enjoyable listen, even if it's not the most perfect album in the world. And more than anything, it doesn't go on for too long, and it never wears too thin or anything like that, and arguably that's the most important part about it. I think an argument could certainly be made that many albums across any genres of music, whatever it be it death metal or experimental jazz, no matter what genre you're talking about, that many albums don't really know how to wrap themselves up. They just sort of either drag their feet on for too long, or they end too quickly and don't really reach their full conceptual potential. But I really do think Crash found that sort of perfect meeting point in the middle between not overstaying its welcome and not ending before it even starts. In fact, Crash recognizes the exact coordinates of its boundaries, and instead of trying to go outside of them, it just sort of stays within those boundaries, within those limits, within its own lane, and just kind of attempts to perfect its base ideas, which is something that I can definitely respect about an album like this, and I definitely appreciate. With that being said, it does make some of the aforementioned issues like the lack of creativity a touch more embarrassing overall, considering they really shouldn't be there if you're making a shorter album that you're working even harder on. But at the same time, I do feel like, nonetheless, it's important for the album to not overstay its welcome, and it certainly hasn't in my eyes. Overall, Crash is a pretty heavy example of missed potential. This could have been the Adrenaline Junkie sequel to How I'm Feeling Now, but instead it's just another synth pop album and another dance pop album. But ultimately, that's okay with me. This is Charli kind of looking back on an earlier sound that was very imperfect, and I won't say perfecting it because obviously this album itself is not perfect, but at least bettering it to some extent now that she's in a more musically mature period, and that's something that's at least good to see. So with that being said, I'm going to give this album 3.5 stars out of 5. I don't think it's the greatest thing ever, but you know what? It's a fun listen, it's enjoyable, and I would still recommend it to anyone that's just looking to either chill or just have a fun, kind of good times party album to give a listen to. So, yeah, 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I will see you guys in the next one.